Everybody for coming in. We're going to get started in about a minute. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, hello, everyone. I'm host Safina. I work with the Power in Nature Coalition. I'm an environmental advocate for EPIC, the Environmental Protection Information Center up on the North Coast. Today, we are so excited to have Amanda here today with us. Amanda Kochanek is the Senior Project Manager and Geospatial Data Analyst and will be for the GreenInfo Network and will be presenting to us today on how to use GreenInfo Network's database and teach us how they're tracking 30 by 30 projects and helping us get closer to our goal by doing so. So after our presentation today with Amanda, we'll have a robust Q&A. People were invited to submit their questions prior to the presentation, but you can also pop them in the chat either during the presentation if they're specific to the presentation, or also during or after during the Q&A session. Amanda, thank you so much for being here today. I'll let you take it away.
Okay, great. I'll start by sharing my screen. I have that up for you here. So as noted, I'm Amanda Kochanek. I've been at GreenInfo for about 25 years now, and much of that time has been involved in CPAD and CCED, and now 30 by 30. So we'll be talking about all of that today. A quick introduction, if you're not familiar with GreenInfo Network, we're a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1996, initially just California. We do have staff that reach more widely now, from Seattle, Oregon, Vermont, Washington, D.C., et cetera. But the majority of our work tends to be based in California, although we do have some broader projects. One of the main things, so there'll be two major databases that we're going to talk about today. The first one is the California Protected Areas Database. So this is a GIS inventory of data across the state of California. So this is open source data. You can go download this at any point and use it without restriction. We just actually released an update late last week. So if you've been using CPAD, you probably want to go grab the new version if you have a desktop, or the new services online for those. So this update took us up to 49.9 million acres. I wanted it to be 50, but we were just far enough away that we couldn't quite get there. But it is a continually updated database. So despite putting a release out, we do have piles of edits of things that we know we need to get to. So it's being updated all the time, and your submissions are always welcome. We try to fold them in by the release after you've submitted it, but it really depends on having enough information and staffing to get to that. So CPAD shows those lands protected in fee title across the state by any number of organizations. So we're going out to county, city, other jurisdictional governments. We also talk to nonprofits, land trusts, and other agencies that are interested in land protection, both in fee title or easement. And these are predominantly based on assessor ownership for where we're defining these properties. The complementary database that is smaller in terms of number, but also critically important, are those lands protected by a conservation easement. Now, many of these lands are not open or accessible to the public, but they're critical in particular for something like 30 by 30, where we're looking for protection of biodiversity. Again, it's an open database. We just released its update also late last week, and we're up to 2.6 million acres. This was a really robust update for CCED. So in particular, if you're using CCED, that would be a critical one to make sure that you refresh your data and get all of those new easements in there. It's long been known that easements are harder to identify where they've been placed in the state, find the information about them, and then track them. So we do know that that data is in more need of updates or has more holes in it that we're hoping to fill. So we continually work on that one also. So what I want to talk about at a higher level today is the fact that we have these two foundational databases. We have the free title properties that are protected in California, and we have the California Conservation Easement Database for those lands. And so what those are doing are feeding into 30 by 30. So 30 by 30 is supposed to be the measure of how many lands are protected for biodiversity, and we want to get to 30% by the year 2030. The issue is that this is not simply a fact of adding those lands that are in CPAD that I talked about in fee title and adding those lands that are in easement. So if you put those two together, you're not going to get what goes into 30 by 30. And the reason for that is that 30 by 30 has additional criteria or things that need to qualify in order to count for 30 by 30. So for example, in CPAD, you're going to have a huge array of parks, and I'll sort of walk you through some of those examples. So parks can be many things. So one that you would think of that is likely, and in this case does count for 30 by 30, would be a national park. Something that can get a little more into the gray areas in a regional park. So is this park managed for the region to use as a recreational resource? Is it used to manage for biodiversity, or is it used for both? And that's where we start to find some nuance. Then you get into ones that are more clear-cut. They're a good fit for CPAD because they're a local recreational park in an urban environment, say, but they're mostly paved. They have recreational resources, and they're not really serving biodiversity. So CPAD and CCED are meant to be broader data sets that you then filter down to your needs. So some people, like state parks, go after these parks saying, where are we serving the public that need to get out in the environment? 30 by 30 is saying, where are we protecting biodiversity? So another example of an urban park that's not very likely to qualify for a 30 by 30 measure here. So this starts to ask the question of, okay, we have CPAD and CCED shown in blue, and then over the top, they're shown in green if they count towards 30 by 30. And how do you get from the blue to determining what counts in 30 by 30 or what's shown here as in green? And this comes back to the 30 by 30 initiative saying that they were going to go with the system of gap codes, which is out of USGS, and it's looking at these key three things that we've talked about here. One is that they want a property that has permanent protection from conversion of an unnatural state. So either CPAD or CCED is the first threshold. So you need either permanent protection through an easement or permanent protection through fee title. So one of those two must be met. The second one is that conservation for biodiversity needs to be important, and it needs to also, as a result of that, minimize unnatural disturbances on that property. And then the third one, which has been one of the harder ones to quantify and answer with agencies when working, is what qualifies as a management plan. So those lands have to be in CPAD or CCED as protected. They need to prioritize biodiversity on the land, but then they also need to show that they have a management plan to maintain that into the future. So if the properties meet these three criteria, that's how they move from being in CPAD and CCED to also counting in 30 by 30. So you ask, once, those are the three criteria, but how are they actually tagged or ranked or managed? And so the USGS system for this is the gap code system, and they have 4 codes, one being the most protected. Essentially, you're prioritizing biodiversity and almost nothing else. You're letting natural disturbances occur, such as wildfire at times, things that would naturally occur on the landscape if it weren't for human intervention are going to allow to proceed. Gap 2 allows for a little bit more interaction with the land or management of things such as fire or invasive species, things of that nature. Actually, invasive species could be removed in Gap 1 too, but a little more use. I think it's up to 5% of the property could have more intensive use. So like in a national park, you are going to have oftentimes parking lots or hotels or trailheads. That's not going to disqualify the property if the overall 95% of it is arching towards biodiversity. Gap 3 is something that you would think of as more of a regional park that's highly focused on recreation versus biodiversity. So those do not count. And Gap 4 is something that might just be a paved playground or a wood chip log area for youth to play, or we simply don't know the protection level. So unfortunately, USGS has put Gap 4 as not counting, but also as unknown. So there's a little bit of confusion or there, but really at the end of the day, if your properties qualify to be ranked as GAP 1 or GAP 2, that's what allows them to move into the 30 by 30 measure. I'm going to pause there just to say, are there any immediate questions that I should answer before I keep going? Nothing? All right, I'll keep going. So how do you get at assigning GAP code statuses to properties? We have a number of resources, and this one that I'm showing you here, we're not going to walk through at least right now. We could come back to it later if there are specific questions or examples folks want to walk through. But really the idea is saying, if you think of a property that you own or manage as an agency, is it permanently protected? Yes, then you continue on to the other two questions that I talked about for the eligibility. And if not, you would go this direction. So at the end of the day, if your lands are straightforward in terms of how USGS thinks of GAP and biodiversity, this may lead to your answer. But also don't be surprised if you find yourself falling between a 2 and a 3 and you're not quite sure. That's an area where you can reach out to us. We have additional resources and we'll try to work with you to understand that. So remember, CPAD plus CCED, you need to be in those databases as a start, but that does not mean you will automatically roll into 30 by 30. Instead, what we have is this. So the more limited version of CPAD and CCED, the GAP 1 and the GAP 2, those become what counts in 30 by 30. That then gets pushed up to the California State website that you can see here. I believe this is going to be refreshed in July or August with the new data we published last week. So we are expecting an update. We are expecting this number to go up on the 24%. So there will be an increase from data improvements in the last year that we've been getting from folks, probably some of on this call or those of you who have talked to us in the past. So the problem is that GAP codes that we have in CPAD and CCED are incomplete, and sometimes they're wrong. And so there was a lot of debate in the first sort of, well, not really debate, but discussion, the first sort of 6 months of trying to figure out how 30 by 30 was going to be applied, what was going to be the measure, how is it going to be rolled forward. And at the end of the day, the solution became pretty clear that the folks who are going to know how the land is managed and protected are those that are actively closest to the land owning or managing that property, not having a state down system where somebody at a higher level in the jurisdiction is trying to apply land codes to lands that are very local. So what that means is that we need to go out and talk to all of the agencies or receive information somehow from all of those agencies across the state, which is over 1,000, probably close to 2,000 at this point, to say, okay, we know that you own or manage properties in the state, and we would like to know what you think is the most appropriate GAP code. So the good news is that you get to assign the GAP code to your own properties. The bad news is that you need to assign the GAP codes to your own properties. So there are some bulk assumptions, like if you have information in PAD US, that's already going to come into us. If you happen to work with California State Parks, they have told us about the GAP codes on their properties. So sometimes data is already being folded in on your behalf. But if you look at it and you don't like the code that is assigned, you have the ability and the authority to request that we change that. But that also means that you have to go through, look at what we have for your GAP code assignment, determine if that's correct or not, and then tell us what you would like that GAP code to be. So unfortunately, it does mean work on your part, which I know is not what most of us need in our lives, more work. We're already busy. So we do try to make that as easy as possible. And there are a number of us who are happy to work with you to make that hopefully as seamless as possible. So what we're doing is asking you to review, first of all, do we have your properties in CPAD or CCED accurately? If you find you don't, the first step is just saying, hey, you know, I do or don't own this property. You're missing it or you have it misassigned, and we get that corrected. The second is understanding GAP codes and how they apply to what you're doing on your properties, and then tell us what the most appropriate GAP code is and send that back to us. I will say that you can assign a GAP code and I can put it into the next release, and you can change your mind down the line. So if you tell me my gap code is a 3, and next year decide, oh, no, our protections are stronger. We found a management plan. You can upgrade to a 2. There's no penalty. There's no problem there. It's fine to submit what you think is the best gap code now, knowing that you can move that forward in the future if you need to. And also, if you find that you're stuck and having a hard time deciding between 2 gap codes, do feel free to reach out to us and we'll try to help find the resources. I am not myself a gap specialist, but we do work with USGS. They're helping to clarify. So I just want to mention that the gap system was made for a national assignment of properties, and we want to allow it to work at the state and local level, and USGS is helping us do that, but this is a work in progress. So we are continuing to refine the language in the gap system to help folks do that. So we want to make this process as easy as possible because, as I said, I know you're all busy and you don't want any more tasks if you can help that. So we're willing to work with you in a variety of ways. And I'll walk through those. I think we have plenty of time today. So I'm going to walk through a little bit more of the options on those just to let you know. So the first is if you already have your own GIS data and you feel like it's accurate, you can just send it in the format you have. You can send us an email. I'll have that at the end, or you could send it to me even directly if need be. But you could just say, here's our GIS data. It's accurate. It's good. Please go look at it, compare, and resolve your data wherever it conflicts in there. We would go through that. If we found conflicts that we were unclear about, we'd come back to you with a short list of questions that we needed to clarify. Maybe you don't have GIS. That option means that you could download the GIS that are, maybe you use GIS, but you don't have GIS files of your own properties. You could go download what we have and look at them and use that as feedback. If you don't have GIS, don't want to use GIS, that's fine also. We have online tools and maps that I'll show you. If you have existing reports, tables, list of APN properties, any of those are all acceptable means to send us data about your properties. But we also have a toolkit. So let me just pop through. So we have one main page where we try to have admittedly too much information at this point, but categorized about the different things going on within 30 by 30. So the first one is this ability to download a toolkit. If you download a toolkit, I'm actually just going to go to this site live because we might as well. So if you were to download a toolkit, what this is giving you the most recent data that we have in CPAD and CCED as of the night before. So if you requested edits from me last week and I told you tomorrow, oh, we've been able to get to your edits, we've refreshed them, you can go look at them now and make sure that you like them, you could come here to download that data. Or if you just wanted, so you could download all of CPAD and CCED, but that's going to be the whole state. Maybe you're just one small agency. You could look by your own agency name, as I'll show you here. So Nature Conservancy could come in, start to type ahead, find their list, download this zip file. And what this is going to contain is 4 things. It'll have a set of shape files for the fee and easement lands if you have GIS. If you don't have GIS, it'll have 2 tables. So you can open those in Excel. It'll show the list of your properties, the names, the size, and it also has a link to a map so that you could go to our map collaborator, which I will open. I should have had this ready, but I did not. Well, let me find it through here actually. So in that table, you could open up a property. It would allow you to click a link. That link will take you to this site and zoom you into the exact park that's listed in your table. So you could review the shape, see if you like it. You can submit feedback here, or you can write that in the table that you want. So we also have information about gap codes. And so you can find plenty of information here on this toolkit page. So if you want to learn more about what gap codes they are, we actually have the actual language out of USGS here that you can come back to and read. The flow chart I showed earlier was here, and some of the summary that we've been talking through about what's in 30 by 30 and how it moves from CPAT and CCED into here. So basically, this is a resource to come back to if I talked about something, you can't quite remember the details and you want to come back and look at it. We do also post the webinar slide decks and recordings, so this one will be added to it, but here are all the previous ones we've given in the past few months. A couple are available in Spanish, and we try to make sure all have closed captions. But if you find there's something that's not meeting your needs here, let us know on those. So back to my slide deck here. So our main goal is to keep things as current as possible. So we want to correct data that might be wrong or things we might be missing, but I know you're all also actively working on new projects. So we need to sort of constantly be going through the process of requesting data, updating, and adding new records into our system. And the way that we're moving ahead with gap status is what ultimately qualifies you or disqualifies that property from counting in 30 by 30. And so each release looks to improve, expand, and correct previous entries. That's both adding new data and improving gap codes. And you can submit new or revised data as frequently as you want or need. So if you say, hey, I can look at half of my properties this year and give them to you, and maybe next year I'll get to the second half, that's fine also. You can divide the work, or you can say, I'm going to look at my fee right now and maybe next year easement, or however you need to break that your work apart into pieces is perfectly acceptable. So how you help is making sure that your data is accurate, as I said, in the two databases. If you're talking to other agencies that own and manage land, just making sure they're aware of 30 by 30. Have they looked at their information in CPAT and CCED? Do they feel like they're being accurately represented in 30 by 30? If you're finding that you're with a small subgroup that has similar questions, we're happy to facilitate more specific webinars or just working group meetings where we talk about, hey, we have similar type lands, we're stuck between a gap 2 or a gap 3 assignment. We'd like to be consistent. Let's talk through the problems together and try to come up with a more universal solution. This is great because it actually sort of builds a conceptual consistency across the data. So knowing that you have an agency that's similar to yours in the lands that they protect is a really good way to work together to make sure that we're getting consistent results. If you have a smaller or larger group or discussion working group, we're happy to help pop in and try to facilitate learning what your questions are, going back to USGS to get more clarity on gap codes if needed, or just working with you on questions that we might already be able to answer. So that slide is actually out of date. I will skip it. So it's a little bit early to end. I did want to come back to a couple key things unless there are immediate questions. But they may also be items that come up in discussion. So any questions, or I can go through some sort of more frequently asked and recent findings if people are interested. And I do see one raised hand, although that's all I see is the hand. And I think if folks are able to unmute on their own, I'm fine with people just chiming in.
Yeah, yes. Just a quick question. What type of data are you are those packages containing? Is it just location, or is there other information that's being that you need to put in there?
Yeah, so if you download our information and you were to look, I can actually scan forward in the toolkits that we have, it's going to download a shapefile that actually has polygon geometry. So one thing I will say is that if your agency doesn't currently have property data, GIS property level data, you're free to go grab this and use this as you need, either inside or outside of 30 by 30. It is an open data set. So you would download that, you would get a shapefile. It's based, as you can see here, these interior lines are assessor parcel data whenever possible. So this is what we refer to as a holding, so the smaller subsections. And then this broader outline is the full unit. So this is all managed as the Dangerman Preserve, but it has all these individual pieces if you look at the legal ownership of that property. So we offer both of those. And if you don't have GIS, the table would download the name of the property, if the I think they're all allowed here. If the public is allowed to access it, who owns, who manages, the size. So those sort of core basic things that are here. In order to submit, the key things we need are the who owns and manages the property. It's helpful to have a name, although it's not required. And then the acreage so that we make sure we get the approximate area. So if you don't have everything, it can still be added. But those are sort of the core things that we really hope to get.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. We have a couple questions in the chat, and I'll read the first one off to you. Are federal lands such as national forests assessed on unit or local levels for GAP status, or are there blanket assumptions like all U.S. Forest Service lands are GAP 2, such as?
Yeah, that's a good question. So National Forest Service and similarly BLM do not get a blanket 2 because they are not protected from conversion. They can and do move out of protection. So the reasons that they do and can qualify, and we do see them qualifying, is it could be national forest, but also part of a wilderness area, or have an easement over it that has stipulations that it can't be changed. So being Forest Service alone is not enough. It does need to have additional assurance of permanent protection to qualify. And also a management plan, which that management plan needs to be, not necessarily for timber. It can include timber if it's done appropriately and at a moderate scale, but it does have to have a management plan for how you're managing for biodiversity into the future.
Cool. Thank you. How is restoration tracked and counted toward 30 by 30?
That's a good one. So it's interesting that the GAP system is the intent of the management. So it could be, there is the case that say you have recently purchased a property or a conservation easement, that land needs to be restored, but you already have a management plan and funds that will restore it to a GAP 2 level. That actually counts at that point. So at the point that you have the permanent protection and the management plan enacted, like you don't have to actually on the ground have the work entirely completed. So you can be in active restoration and still qualify as long as you can show the legal intent to move that forward.
Great. How often are databases updated to reflect new acreage numbers? And I think you mentioned this.
Yeah, I did, but it was a little indirect. So we are updating every day. So we have 3 to 4 editors behind the scenes editing nearly all the time. That goes out to the public twice a year. So we have a release, like I said, came out on last Thursday or Friday. That was 2024A. So our 2024A release the A version comes out in June. And then we'll continue our edits now that go until December. And at that point, we'll put out 2024B. So comes out twice a year. But we are updating all the time, every day. And if you download the toolkits that are shown online, those actually reflect the draft or beta data behind the scenes pre-release. So you do have a window into seeing the data as it is. The reason it's not a live service is because it requires a lot of QA and just sort of double checking things before we push it out to official data set. So twice a year.
Super cool. Awesome. How do we report data to be included in the 30 by 30 tracking efforts?
Yeah, so if you have property and you think they should be counted in 30 by 30, if you're able to go look at the resources we have and check that they're counted, that's ideal. And if you think they're not right, you let me know. If this is still too overwhelming and you can just contact me with your agency name, I'm happy to say, here's a report of where you are now and make it a little more straightforward for you, hopefully quicker. And you can tell me if you think that's wrong or right. If you think it needs adjusting, then we can work together on it. So don't be afraid to reach out. But if you're not intimidated by this, you could go grab your toolkit and update to what you think it should be.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there any more questions at this time for Amanda?
So one thing that comes up, I'll go over a couple of frequently asked questions that haven't come up yet. But once folks get into the data, one thing that tends to come up is, what if this is, I'll use this example, what if this is my preserve and this half down here qualifies and this half up here does not? That's perfectly fine. So you can report gap codes down to any level, even down to a parcel, as a percentage. So you could say of this whole preserve, what we're calling a unit, 50% qualifies, 50% does not. You don't have to tell us where that 50% is. We know it's already a big lift to ask folks to get us information on the spatial extent of where their properties are. So what we do is we get the spatial extent, we report to you the acreage, and then you can tell us what percentage of that is gap 1, 2, 3, or 4, and it can be mixed across those sources. So that does come up pretty frequently as soon as someone starts to look at their property and they're like, well, a third of it counts and half of it doesn't, and I don't know about the other part. So we can accommodate that at any level. Conversely, if you have a bunch of properties and they're all really, really large with a lot of parcels, but you know they're all gap 2, you can just say, I want a blanket to assignment to all my properties, and we can do that for you also. Let's see, other questions. So we prioritize the gap code that comes from the agency that manages the property locally. That's the first ideal source for that code. If you own the property someone else manages, you can help contribute the code if it's easier and the managing agency prefers or just doesn't have the capacity, you could. If it's a third party that a person who doesn't necessarily own or manage the property, but has a gap code recommendation, we take that back to the managing and owning agency and ask if it's appropriate. So that's how that flow works. Also, if you open our data and you see that you've been assigned a 3 or a 4, and that is not accurate, please don't be offended. Those come often from PAD-US, which is a national level, and you'll see it in the source if that's the case. We are happy to update that property, and we do know that occurs. It's not to say that we don't know what you're doing is critical to 30 by 30, and we would love to correct that with you. And then Lauren and Ella dropped a note, I believe, in the chat, and I just wanted to let you know that CNRA actually has 2 fellows this summer who have already been immensely helpful in the last release and are here to help moving forward. So if you've been hesitant to dive in about gap codes and trying to assign them to your properties, we do have 2 additional folks helping us for a few months here. So it would be a great time to jump in knowing that we have that additional resource.
Thanks, Amanda. We have
Yeah.
one more question in the chat. Could
Sure.
you please re-describe how a project gets categorized or tracked as a restoration project? It just has to be slated with the intent to restore, or it actually needs plans / permit, etc.
So when you go back, I know this one's a little confusing, and let me see if it helps to go back all the way to the beginning. Make everyone dizzy. Okay, so because we're using the gap code system, it's all going back to intent. So the number one, so it doesn't actually come down to have you restored or not. It comes down to A, is it permanently protected? And then B sort of lumps these 2 together of, do you have a management plan that's active and that's going towards biodiversity? So that may mean that you have one and you're in wonderful shape and has all the biodiversity doing everything you want already. That would count. But it could also say that we have a management plan. We know we acquired a property that's not ideal, and we actively are working towards improving it. So you do need what you're asking here in your question of, you do need a plan to show that you are going forward with this restoration. It just doesn't have to be completed or even, started at that point, as long as you're showing, and this is one of the very difficult gray areas where there can be a lot of nuanced question. But I would say if you have a management plan and it's prioritizing biodiversity, you're pretty close there. So feel free to check with us if you're hesitant, but you're likely to qualify.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. I know that can be a confusing one, but it's helpful to know that you guys are there and people can reach out if they're unsure.
Yes, and I'll reiterate that both myself, Ella, and Lauren are here to help, but we also don't necessarily know the answers. Sometimes we're helping you find the answer. So
Awesome. Perfect. Are there any other questions for our presenter today?
a question, has anyone tried to submit data or looked at anything? from here. We like feedback too. Like if you're finding you download our files and they're difficult, please let us know rather than suffer. So any feedback that you have, or if anybody's tried any of these reviews or processes, I'd be happy to hear about that. So go back to contact. So for contact information, you are free to reach out to me directly, which is just amanda@greeninfo.org. But I do list this one instead, just because then you have 4 staff monitoring that email. So this will probably get you a bit quicker of a response if you were to use that, but you are welcome to also email me directly.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda.
Yeah, and then so the next time that this is going to be pushed out is December. So if you're looking to get me a submission that's going to roll into December, ideally you would have something to me by early to mid-October. I don't know, maybe Halloween is sort of your drop dead. But if you work with that deadline, you should feel, certainly with gap codes, if you get me anything by that date, it will be done. The issue is that some of the geometry edits take a little bit longer, so try to lean into those a little bit sooner. But yeah, aim for October-ish on the deadline, and knowing that then your data would come out of our system, CPAD and CC, in December, and then it takes the state about a month or 2 to update the 30 by 30 reflection then.
That is super useful information. I will be sure to send that deadline out to our coalition.
How
Thank you.
far away from 30? We were at 24.4. Let me come back to the state site. So the question was, how far away are we from the goal of 30 by 30? So it was 24.4. We're going to go up from there, just this last edit that hasn't come out live. I don't know the actual numbers because the state needs to do a little bit of adjusting on their end, but I would say 25-ish% is where we're at, give or take. So we're looking at about 5% needed to be added by 2030, or yeah, by 2030.
Awesome.
And this site itself should be updated, I believe, by August, hopefully maybe even July.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today and giving us all this wonderful information. This is a lot, and I will certainly be rewatching this recording for my own knowledge. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and then once we hit the target, are we done or go over? Yes. What I've started to hear more in some areas, in particular the Bay Area, is 50 by 50. So if you look at the 10-county Bay Area, they're actually already over the 30% target. But this is meant to be a starting place, not a finishing. So 30 by 30 feels a bit far out, but it's actually just the first step, hopefully, in terms of longer term protection. So I don't know that California will do 50 by 50, but I am seeing regions do that already, and I would expect that there will be a bigger push after.
Absolutely. Barbara?
If we want to look at conserved areas in our county, is there a way to do that?
There are a couple of ways. One is you could download the whole state databases for the 2, or if that's not easy for you, you could just shoot me an email and I'll send you a link to download just the county files. Or yeah, it would just be filtering down to a subset, which we're happy to help do if that's easier for you.
Right, thanks.
Yeah, and that's so one of the main things, well, the main reason CPAD and CCED first started 25 years ago was that when you work in an area, it's nice to know who's working around you. So the toolkits are a bit of a way to say, okay, I want to focus on correcting my lands, but you often do want to see what your neighbors and adjacent properties are. So you can go grab the full state at any time. Like I said, it's free for use, however you want to use the data of the fee or easement, but we're also happy to give you subsets if that's more helpful. And both CPAD and CCED come with extensive user manuals, so I wouldn't expect that nearly anyone would want to read them all because there are multiple pages, but they're helpful if you just do sort of a control find for keywords you're interested in, and they have data dictionaries and things that can help you. So.
Fantastic.
All right, well, I'll hang out for a few more minutes if folks want to drop off, but if anybody has key questions, chime in or send me an email when they occur to you.